Hello and welcome, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at Follie. My first impression of her wasn't really good, I have to be honest. After testing her out in both Archimedes, though, I changed my mind. She is amazing at so many things. In a way, she's very similar to Koumei, except she doesn't need to complete challenges to perform her shenanigans. By shenanigans, of course, I mean her second ability. Undeniably, it's her most interesting and valuable skill, so it requires a whole separate segment of the video. First, let's quickly run through the rest of her abilities. Her first skill lets her teleport a few meters forward, and most importantly, gives her 3.5 seconds of invulnerability. As a bonus, the splash that happens during the teleportation also puts ink onto the surrounding enemies. This ink is her passive, and to put it simply, it slows the enemies as well as providing some health and energy orbs. Now let's move to her third ability. It's somewhat similar to Saren's Molt. By the way, both abilities are subsumable, the helmet. So once again, to put it simply, Follie's self-portrait ability spawns an ink copy of her that attracts enemy attention, as well as redirecting a portion of damage dealt to Follie and her allies onto itself. Just as her first ability, it also puts the ink from the passive onto enemies. Now let's take a look at her ultimate. It's kind of similar to the ultimates of Koumei, Neja, and Zephyr. It attaches balloons to enemies that lift them up into the air, as well as dousing them with the ink from the passive. If the balloons are popped, the enemies suffer from relatively high damage. So, with all of that boring stuff out of the way, let's finally take a look at Follie's second ability called Shadow Graph. As I mentioned previously, Follie is somewhat similar to Koumei. This ability is exactly the reason for that. Shadow Graphs function similarly to Koumei's Omamori. Both of these abilities let their users do something that is usually impossible in most game modes. But this video isn't about Koumei, so let's focus on Follie. Not all Shadow Graphs do something incredible, but some aspects of this ability are pretty crazy. The craziest thing that this skill can do is probably letting you spawn a random lock surge that is super overpowered. There are some restrictions though. First of all, the most OP buff that gives you infinite ammo is disabled, and there's also a 7-minute cooldown between lock surges that you can spawn. As a little bonus, creating one of these also makes a random Eximus enemy to appear nearby. Anyway, another really strong Shadow Graph is the Explosive Barrel. This might not seem like much, but it actually is. Its damage is affected not only by your ability strength, but also by the enemy level. The best part about these barrels is the fact that there is no cooldown for them whatsoever. Most other things that this ability lets us spawn are either insanely useful, but very situational items, or simply weaker CC or damaging entities. Alright, let's now take a look at the build that I designed for Follie. Let's first discuss the means of survivability that I use. First of all, it's the combo of her first ability and the rolling guard mode. When these two are paired with the arcane Aegis and shield gating, Follie becomes rather hard to kill. But what's special about this? Most warframes can be made really tough to kill, so let's now discuss the other mods. I decided to install these two archon mods into her. Stretch is kind of obvious because Follie's arc trap applies electricity status really well. Flow, however, is less obvious. Normally, it's the least useful of the archon mods, but with Follie, it might just make sense. Because her explosive barrels are sometimes embedded with cold damage. So this little mechanic, especially when paired up with her passive, provides a lot of energy orbs. If that is not enough for you though, make sure to install an equilibrium shard or maybe use the arcane energize. So what about the ability strength? I decided to go with blind range because I didn't feel many problems with energy economy. I decided to top it off with Molt Augmented and Augur Secrets. As well as some strength, Follie also needs at least some duration, so I went with primed continuity. The only thing that's left to discuss is the range. I decided to give Follie a lot of range in order to put as much ink from her passive on the enemies as possible. Oh, there's also a neat customization mechanic that lets you draw your own icons for every single shadow graph. Here's what I came up with. And that's it. Please tell me in the comments, what do you think about Follie? Bye.